I'm hoping to do a video today asking people to make their comments on how they build community, how they can eventually make up their own institutions that are built on healthier principles, because the ones we are dealing with now are finally showing themselves as being corrupt in many ways. Governments and corporations are founded on stealing and taking people's property without their consent. And this is the contrast that's showing up more and more dramatically, at least at times like this in Calgary. And we've got all this water flowing behind me, and it's an unusually green and lush for this time of year. And yet there's this ever-increasing contrast between what nature gives us and what the government and corporations let us keep. The middlemen are taking more and more, whereas in a highly efficient economy, the main way people get more efficient is by eliminating the middleman and dealing with each other directly. So I'm looking for your input and hoping to share a bit of information from other people on how they have started to build relationships with each other that make themselves less dependent on criminal setups. Some of these are things like bulk purchases. I find that if I go to the store and they're selling 50 pounds of potatoes for the same price as 20 pounds of potatoes, I could buy the 50 pounds and give away half of what I bought. And I found that there's always a demand for it. And potatoes in my area, at least, were very easy to give away. Neighbors would be quite happy to accept them because it would save them time going to the store, and practically everybody seemed to use them. Dog walking was a popular one. A lot of people said they didn't know how to meet their neighbors, and once they started walking their dogs and meeting the other people who were walking dogs, or providing a conversation starter for those who weren't walking dogs, that it allowed them to get talking to people. Other things are like garage sales or barbecues or anything you can organize. And with this, it would be handy if people could have contact points, so you have someone you can notify online, and then they can pass it off the notification to people who are offline. There's also a lot of things that are becoming, cheaper because they're being replaced by technology, and books and DVDs are getting recirculated in an organized fashion. This would be even better if we could meet the people who are the sources of them and just start redistributing the material amongst them, because there's far more material in people's houses than there is in libraries. You can access only a small proportion of it in a library. And the people who have all this excess material are probably much closer to you than the library branch is, and will let you have it more cheaply than the library will, because you don't have to risk paying a fine if you're just giving it away. DVDs in particular have gotten really cheap because some people aren't using them anymore, and there's this vast store of entertainments that are not being used from a cloud or stored on a disk somewhere. I'm saying all this because we're in a stage in Alberta, at least of breakdown in our government and corporate structure. It was supposedly based on resource wealth and on corporations that would pay royalties to the government for extracting resources from underground, which would then be used to fund public programs. And at one time, Alberta even had a surplus, and they would put excess money into a trust fund that could be invested and supposedly provide for all Albertans in the future. But now the whole thing has gone into reverse. It's gotten to the stage where oil companies are actually taking money out of the trust fund to make losing investments, in fact, to cover up other companies' losses. There are these large liabilities that get incurred because an oil company, when it comes onto people's land, it's not like when you rent out your house, because in the strictest sense they don't pay rent. They just pay for loss of use. So that would be a little bit like when someone comes to rent a house and they have to put up a damage deposit, except that the oil company doesn't put up the damage deposit that will later be collected if they don't do damage to the property. They pay on an ongoing basis most of the time for damage that occurs on a yearly basis. So all they really pay is damage. There's payment for loss of use, not rent in the strictest sense. And since the land is being taken without the landowner's consent, or will be taken by a government agency who will issue a right of entry order to the company if the landowner doesn't agree on what the oil company should pay him or her, then all these lands are taken or can be taken without the owner's consent and without a damage deposit that's put up at the time that the oil company goes onto the land and is set aside and invested to pay for the eventual cleanup costs at the end. And these are huge. They're estimated from tens to hundreds of billions of dollars for all the wells in Alberta, and they're presently uncovered, and oil companies are skipping out or making the taxpayers foot the bill for them. Just the physical costs of plugging up these wells, which may not even be the smartest thing, because some of them might be usable as geothermal energy sources, because when someone wants to get heat from the ground, they typically drill a well to do it. In this case, you'd already have a well drilled. So it may not be the best thing to simply plug them when they're abandoned. But if they get abandoned legally, that is typically what's done. You put cement down and put a plug in. But eventually, all of these well bores will decay, they'll break down, and hydrocarbons, not only from the target zone for which the well was drilled to exploit, but higher up, will start to leak up and out of the ground at a greater rate than you would have had under natural conditions. So there's a huge potential cost, because it's not healthy to breathe methane and oil and other natural gas liquids and so on. There can be significant health effects, especially when these things are drawn out of the ground quickly in large quantities. And there are cases in the United States where there seem to be increased incidences of cancer, birth defects, and other diseases within a significant radius of natural gas facilities. And there's also always natural gas, practically always associated with the drilling of an oil well. So these things have substantial costs, but since the surface rights and the mineral rights are separate, and people's surface rights have to be essentially violated to get at the mineral rights if the landowner doesn't consent. And there are government agencies that, in hindsight, it seems, have been not performing their task and have not considered the public interest, have not weighed how much it would cost the landowner eventually before letting the oil company onto the land, and in practical purposes have not taken a view any significantly differently than what the oil company would take. Then in these cases, the government agencies that let the oil companies on the land did not give due process to the landowners, because they effectively were not operating at arm's length. They either were so successfully lobbied by the oil companies, or infiltrated by them, or acted in a way by their very nature as to be indistinguishable from them, and that made it a case, in every case, I would argue, of trespassing on people's land. And these trespasses go on year after year, decade after decade, and many people aren't even aware of the true extent to which their rights have been violated until the time for cleanup comes, and possibly the oil company skips town and leaves someone holding the bag, most likely the landowner and the taxpayer. So this is everyone's issue now, because city dwellers as well have to pay for this increased cost, because the province of the municipality that used to run on oil revenues is now hiking everybody's property taxes to make up the difference in lost revenue. So this is an effect that's directly tied in, I believe, to the arguments over the presumed bad greenhouse effect, because the only way you can produce massive amounts of oil and gas and lower emissions, or at least the only way that's been significantly proposed to do both at the same time so far, is to pump the carbon dioxide and water back into the ground. Carbon dioxide has been looked at for a long time as a means of secondary oil recovery, but for most of its history, this means has been uneconomic and was supplanted by horizontal drilling for the last 20, 30 years, because that was cheaper. But the eventual plan, as I would see it, would be to declare that water and carbon dioxide are the pollutants, not methane and oil and gas liquids, and say that these are dangerous and we have to pump them back into the ground. This essentially gives the oil companies the opportunity to seize people's land twice. First, to get the hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon out of the ground, and then a second time to pump the hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen back into the ground. So you get people coming and going. You've got both a production and a disposal industry going at once. It shouldn't work this way. If we took the view that all oil and gas production is essentially a waste management industry, then all the people who handle the waste should be paid for doing it. That would mean the consumers should be getting paid to handle these dangerous products and have these poisons pumped through their homes for burning, because they're less dangerous after burning than before. But instead, we're paid to purchase these wastes, and then we're supposed to pay after they're burned. Both of them shouldn't be the case. As far as the land seizure goes, then it's a partial attempt to redefine the polluter. There was a recent Supreme Court of Canada case in which the regulators and the bankruptcy trustees had to deal with the question of who is responsible for cleanup. And the Supreme Court defended the polluter pays principle, that the oil companies should be paying for the costs of cleanup, and they can't escape them through bankruptcy. But if the Supreme Court of Canada goes on to rule that someone has the jurisdiction to tax carbon and water, which it very well might do, because it seems to be just arguing at this point whether it's a federal or provincial jurisdictional point, then that would amount, in my opinion, to a collateral attack on the Supreme Court's own Bedwater decision that the polluter pays. Because if you say that carbon dioxide and water are the pollutants, then you're shifting this whole bill from industry to the consumer and the private landowner, both urban and rural. And the bill is absolutely massive. No one can really know how big it is. It's a little bit like UFO disclosure, where you go to the government. Well, the government doesn't know all of the disclosure stories. The government doesn't know how badly people have been treated, and it can't really put a price on this. The psychological effects, spiritual effects of having your land taken and having the government and industry back it up completely, and having no way to know how to fight them without years of legal research, and then still seeing that they're ignoring the law, it is an immense cost for someone to bear. I'm sure there are cases where people have simply died of the stress of having these invaders on their land year after year and not being able to get rid of them. It's a more dramatic, symbolically, example of what we talk about with these recent disclosures of how women's bodies were violated. And in this case, it's your land, and your ability to make a living, and your equity that people may have spent generations building up being violated. And that we are getting to the stage where the theft economy has progressed to the point where not only people coming up may just abandon the possibility of ever owning a home as a dream, but even those people who spent years accumulating equity in their land, it may just be a dream for them that they'll even be able to hold on to it, because the taxes have gotten so high and the amount of damage to the value of their land has accumulated to such an extent. It is really a land seizure industry that people are not very much aware of, and to which they're only starting to become aware of, right? Because they're like abuse victims. People who've been through this take years to even figure out, and with very other people knowing the full extent of the damage, how bad the damage really is. They don't even realize how badly they've been violated, because the really obvious big bills don't come about until the time comes for the oil company to abandon the site. But the violations of rights that show up when the oil company comes to abandon the site and fails to do so properly have been going on all along, from day one. So we've got a case where the surface is over time, because of inflation and increased demand for land, value is going up and up, or at least the potential value is going up. The value of the hydrocarbons in the ground is going down and down because they're being pumped out, or they're getting more expensive and difficult to pump out. And the ability, of course, of the oil company to pay these bills, or willingness, is dropping all the time. And the responsibility for cleanup has attempted to have been passed off from the original drillers of the property to those who came along afterward. And in many cases, seem to have been companies that were designed simply for the purpose of taking on other companies' liabilities and going bankrupt, so that the original company could try to avoid responsibility. So we're at this point now where we are, I think, going to have to make the original companies pay and make everyone aware of how much damage has been done, because there's no one else who has pockets deep enough. The official companies, virtually all the little ones, mid-sized ones, and even most of the big ones, could be made bankrupt if they were made to pay the full extent of the damages, because trespassing is a form of damage, and it's been going on in all these wells, on all these well sites, and there are something like 300,000 of them since the time that those companies were allowed onto the land, because there were inherent conflicts of interest and people's rights that were trampled on right from the moment that the oil companies came onto the land. Well, there are various other ways that the greenhouse effect is demonized. One of them I've pointed to in that it makes more efficient energy use and helps you grow plants more efficiently. I did that in my greenhouse video. And that is something what energy companies might not want, because it makes people less dependent on them, and it makes them need to use less energy. The greenhouse effect is similar in that it can also provide a passive means of using the sun to heat a house and retain the heat inside directly without the use of oil and gas. And it also, when we call this thing the greenhouse effect or greenhouse gas, which is a misnomer, it ignores the fact that plants use up sunlight. They use sunlight and water and carbon dioxide to grow and store energy. And when you burn the plant, there is a production of heat. Interesting to note there that the heat is the result of, it's the cause of carbon dioxide and water being produced. You get those as a byproduct after the heating, as a result of the heating, not as a cause. But when you burn these things, you are releasing energy that was originally stored by photosynthesis. But according to thermodynamic laws, when you release that energy, you don't get the same quality of energy out as what you put in. There's an increase of entropy law. So the plant takes the sunlight, the carbon dioxide, and the water, and puts them in a more organized structure, its own tissues, which has to be done at a net loss of energy to the environment. In other words, it's using up heat. So even after you burn the plant, you don't get the same effect back again. There's a net cooling and moderation of temperature inherent in having plants grow, and you grow plants inside a greenhouse. But when people discuss the greenhouse effect, they show a heat budget for the Earth. They typically don't include the effects of plants. So there are some major methods of demonizing plants and carbon dioxide and water indirectly. You build up these psychological associations in people's heads, and they don't look at how plants and water and carbon dioxide actually work. We also have a mindset in Canada, and in Alberta particularly, with this resource economy, that wealth has to come from the ground. Well, wealth is a human construct. The monetary system is something that people make up. Wealth, the whole concept, has come from people. It's something we invented. And the means by which we reward people for their labors is also something we can remake at will, and that we can make in a manner advantageous to ourselves if we get communities built up big enough and with the right knowledge. When people get together, they impart value to each other. If we had a proper monetary system that recognized a means of converting the value created to ability to purchase some other good or service, then people would be paid for getting together. They wouldn't have to pay. And people, if they realize this, should set up their own monetary systems or demand that they be set up this way. And we wouldn't be so dependent then on presumed resource revenue, which is really just a system of people, primarily the ones who run the corporations and the government, stealing from everybody else. So we don't need a system that's dependent on the idea that all wealth comes from the ground. Even the wealth that does come from the ground is coming there because of the expertise of people. So another problem with the way that we look at oil and gas is that by blaming carbon dioxide and demonizing the greenhouse, we deflect attention away from the real toxicities of the original products. You say that the carbon dioxide and water are toxic instead of the methane and the gas. Or you say that methane is toxic, not because it's simply poisonous to take in its raw form, but because it makes the world supposedly warmer, which by itself is not really bad for anyone in the northern climates, except for the energy companies who wouldn't be able to sell as much oil and gas after things have already been warmed up. And that's where most of the consumption for heating occurs, and where most of the presumed warming has occurred, because people turn on their gas in the coldest times of the year in winter, and that warms up the surrounding area a little bit. So those are some of the concepts that we are dealing with right now, especially with the Canadian national election coming up. The liabilities, cumulative liabilities, if you include the trespassing, well, nobody knows really just how big they are, because you can't, how do you assess the costs of someone being under constant stress for decades at a time, or being unable to rent out their land for decades at a time, and ultimately not having access to better energy sources and better health options because of the support for the petroleum industry. But just in terms of the trespassing costs, I could guesstimate that they are probably something along the lines, once you wrap them in with the health and safety costs and the costs of abandoning the wells, so probably altogether something equivalent to the existing acknowledged national debt. So you add another national debt on, and that's probably something along the lines of the amount of money we're dealing with here, and which is still undiscussed in the mainstream media, and which the government sources at least can't really be evaluated because it's too big, and only people who've really looked at it in detail and have been subject to the effects themselves can really say how big it is, how big the damages are.